In a modest two-story home nestled in the quiet suburbs of Grand Rapids, Michigan, the faint scent of vanilla and burnt wax lingered in the air. A birthday cake sat untouched on the dining table, its once festive colors now dulled. Margaret Lane, 78 years old, sat quietly in her usual chair, the pearls around her neck glinting softly under the overhead light. The frosting read, "Happy birthday, Margaret." But the candles had long since burned out, like the last remnants of hope in her eyes. There were no balloons, no laughter, no knock at the door, not even a phone call. She had waited, all day, dressed in her best cardigan and floral blouse, lipstick neatly applied, coffee brewed, but they never came. Her children, her grandchildren, the very people she had given her life for. She took a deep breath, picked up the knife, and cut herself a slice. Not out of hunger but ceremony. She lifted the plate toward the photo of her late husband, Harold. "Well, old love. Looks like it's just us again." And with that, a quiet rage took root in her chest. They forgot me in life. I'll forget them in death. What followed over the next 2 years would shock everyone. A quiet woman's devastating revenge, not through poison or punishment, but through the ultimate legacy, her will. Margaret Coleman was born in the spring of 1945, the youngest of 5 children in a farmhouse just outside Grand Rapids. Her father, Jacob, ran a small dairy operation, while her mother, Florence, sewed for the neighboring townsfolk to help keep the family afloat. Life was hard, but filled with laughter and resilience. From a young age, Margaret displayed an uncanny ability to care for others. At just 10, she was already packing lunches for her older brothers and brushing her mother's hair after long days at the sewing machine. She loved stories and would often sneak off with a book in hand to sit under the old oak tree behind the barn. In high school, Margaret was the kind of girl everyone knew but few truly saw. She wasn't loud, but she had a quiet magnetism, a soft, radiant kindness. Her best friend, Jean, would later say that Margaret could hold your whole life in her eyes and never drop a piece. She met Harold Lane during her second year of nursing school. He was tall, gentle, and hopelessly awkward. He worked as a postal clerk and always smelled faintly of cedar and ink. Their courtship was sweet. Long walks, poetry left in mailboxes, dances in the town hall. They married in 1966 and bought a fixer-upper on Maple Street with savings and a loan from Harold's uncle. The house was small, but it echoed with joy. David was born first, then Linda 3 years later. Tommy, the surprise, arrived when Margaret was 38. Raising 3 children wasn't easy. Margaret worked night shifts at the hospital and took in sewing to cover extras. Harold, though devoted, suffered from chronic back pain and eventually took early retirement. Still, Margaret never wavered. She cooked every meal, attended every parent-teacher meeting, stayed up until dawn hemming costumes or making sure science fair boards were picture-perfect. She taught her children compassion, respect, and the sacred value of remembering the people who raised you. She lost Harold in 1998 to a stroke, quietly in his sleep. The grief nearly broke her, but she endured. She always had. She kept their routines, fed the birds in his honor, and never let the garden grow wild. But she was never quite the same. And neither were her children. Didn't happen all at once. The distance came slowly, first like a light fog and then like a wall of silence. David, her eldest, had always been focused, a boy of ambition. He went to law school on a scholarship, eventually settling in New York. As the years went by, phone calls turned into brief texts, and visits became annual obligations. He'd show up with his laptop, constantly typing, even at the dinner table. Margaret understood he was busy, but she missed the boy who once asked her to watch cartoons with him in his pajamas. Linda, the middle child, had always been a bit of a dreamer. She was artistic, emotional, and at times dramatic. Margaret nurtured her creative spirit, helped her with art school applications, and even funded a gap year to find herself in Bali. When Linda discovered wellness coaching, Margaret politely listened to her rants about energy alignment and essential oils, even if she didn't believe in any of it. But as Linda's online following grew, her connection to Margaret seemed to shrink. Visits became filtered Instagram moments. Calls were often cut short. Once, when Margaret asked if she could fly in for Christmas, Linda responded with, "Mom, I just don't vibe with that side of the family anymore." Tommy, the youngest, had always been her baby. He was charming, impulsive, and filled with wild ideas. Podcast startup, kombucha brand, crypto mining rig. Margaret supported him financially far longer than she should have. She didn't mind, she believed in him. But when he missed her 76th birthday because he got an opportunity to go on a networking cruise, something inside her clicked. The last real connection between them had become transactional. They called when they needed something, an opinion, a favor, a loan, but never just to ask, "How are you, Mom?" She once tested it. One week, she decided not to initiate any contact. No texts, no calls, no Facebook comments, and nothing happened. Days became weeks. The silence was deafening. When a neighbor's teenage son dropped off soup because he'd heard she wasn't feeling well, she nearly cried. Not because of the soup, but because it had come unasked. That night, she wrote in her journal, "I used to be the center of their universe. Now I orbit theirs like a forgotten moon." The fracture wasn't dramatic. No shouting matches, no slammed doors, just slow erosion. Indifference disguised as independence. Margaret wasn't angry, at least not yet. But the sadness had rooted itself deep in her bones. And with each year it grew. Margaret had planned it down to the last detail. Garden party. Nothing fancy. Just a table in the backyard, hydrangeas in mason jars, and her famous lemon bars. She sent out invitations. Real ones in the mail, the kind with a wax seal and cursive writing. She even called to confirm each RSVP. David said, "I'll try to make it work. Things are hectic at the firm." Linda replied, "I have a wellness retreat that weekend, but maybe I can rearrange." Tommy said, "I'll be there, Ma. Count on it." The day arrived with blue skies and a soft breeze. Margaret wore her favorite pale yellow dress. Carmen, her caregiver, helped set the table. Biscuit, her cat, pawed playfully at the streamers. At 1 p.m., Margaret checked the driveway. At 2 p.m., she reheated the quiche. At 3 p.m., the first car finally pulled in. It was Tommy, wearing a hoodie and aviators. He handed her a Bluetooth speaker still in its Amazon packaging. "You said you liked music, right? This one's voice-activated." David came an hour later, still on a work call. He hugged her with one arm, phone pressed to his ear. Linda didn't show up until nearly 5. She floated in wearing yoga pants and carrying a crystal-infused water bottle. "Namaste, Mom," she whispered, kissing Margaret's cheek. Liv, Linda's daughter, pulled out her phone and began live streaming. "Say hi to my followers, Grandma." Margaret smiled. But inside, a cold weight settled in her chest. As the sun dipped below the trees, and the guests drifted away, Margaret sat with her untouched slice of lemon cake. She looked around the empty yard and whispered to herself, "They were here, but they weren't present." That night she didn't cry. She cleaned the plates, put the leftovers in Tupperware, and wrote one line in her journal. "This is the last time I beg to be remembered." The months after her 75th birthday passed like slow-moving clouds, heavy, quiet, and gray. Margaret stopped baking. She stopped sending postcards. She stopped reaching out. Not in a loud or spiteful way, but in a gentle, resigned silence. The kind that creeps into a house and makes itself at home. She spent her mornings feeding the birds and watering the same rose bushes Harold had once planted for their anniversary. She still cooked, always for 2, and placed a second plate by Harold's photograph on the mantel. Biscuit, her cat, now her closest companion, would purr beside her as she sipped lukewarm tea and stared at the untouched phone. The children barely noticed. Tommy texted occasionally, usually with links to his latest business venture or asking for just a small loan. "Promise I'll pay you back, Ma." David sent a holiday card. Pre-printed. No signature. Linda left a voicemail once. rambling about a wellness conference in Sedona and asking if Margaret still had her old beaded scarves for vision board decor. Margaret never responded. Carmen, her caregiver, noticed the change first. One afternoon while dusting the bookshelves, she asked gently, "Are you all right, Miss Margaret? You've been so quiet lately." Margaret just smiled. "Sometimes silence says more than words, dear." She began rereading old journals. Decades of notes, dreams, recipes, memories of Harold, scribbles from the children when they were young. In one journal, tucked between a grocery list and a prayer, she had written, "Love is remembering. When they forget you, they forget love." That line stuck with her. She began planning. Not revenge. Not yet. Just preparation. She met with her lawyer, Mr. Branson, a kind-eyed gentleman who had handled her affairs for over a decade. "I'd like to revise my will," she said calmly. Branson raised a brow. "Of course. Any particular changes?" Margaret smiled softly. "I want it to reflect reality." Over the next few weeks, she gathered papers, documented her estate, sorted photo albums, and made quiet decisions. She wrote letters, long ones, one for each child, one for each grandchild, each tucked in envelopes and marked, "To be opened after my passing." She donated to causes she believed in. She left a generous sum to the local library, a scholarship for nurses at the community college, and a large portion to the animal rescue where she had adopted Biscuit. And as for the rest, she left clear instructions. Margaret didn't expect much this year. She made no grand plans, sent no invitations, and baked no cake. But deep down, buried under layers of disappointment and resignation, there was a whisper of hope. Maybe this year, just one of them would remember on their own. She awoke to sunlight creeping across the floorboards, casting warm streaks across the quiet room. The birds chirped outside her window. Biscuit jumped up to curl beside her on the bed. She reached for her phone. No missed calls, no text, no notifications. She got up, dressed herself in the same floral blouse from the year before, and made a single cup of tea. The house was so quiet that even the ticking clock in the hallway seemed to echo. She walked past the mantel where Harold's photograph sat today. "Happy birthday to me," she murmured, and offered him a ghost of a smile. Mid-morning, the doorbell rang. Margaret's heart fluttered. For a moment, she felt something hopeful rise. He opened the door. It was the mailman. Just bills. She closed the door slowly, her face unreadable. By evening, she had made peace with it. They weren't coming. Not even a call. She didn't cry this time. Grief had calcified into something stronger. Clarity. That night, she opened her notebook, the same one where she had recorded decades of holiday menus, family stories, and dreams, and began to write again. But this time, it wasn't letters or memories. It was the final version of her will. She revised every detail with precision. Assets listed, beneficiaries reassigned, conditions set. Her lawyer would get the official draft later, but this was her emotional blueprint. She didn't do it out of vengeance. Not anymore. It was about legacy. And legacy, Margaret decided, should be earned, not inherited. She added one last line to the document. To be remembered is not a right. It's a privilege. Margaret walked into Branson and Keller law offices with a manila envelope tucked under her arm and a fire in her step that belied her age. Mr. Branson, a silver-haired gentleman with soft spectacles and a reputation for discretion, stood to greet her. "Good morning, Margaret. Right on time, as always." She gave him a brief smile. "Let's make this one count." They sat in his office, surrounded by thick leather-bound books and the scent of fresh paper. She placed the envelope on the desk between them. "These," she said, tapping the folder, "are the letters. Personal. One for each child. They're to be delivered after my passing. No sooner." Branson nodded solemnly, understanding without needing to pry. "And the final version of the will." She handed him another folder. "Everything is as we discussed. The charities, the endowments, the memorial fund in Harold's name. The rest, excluded." He opened it briefly, glancing through the pages. "You understand this will cause friction, possibly litigation. I've documented everything. Reasons: copies of ignored messages, missed holidays, medical appointments I faced alone." She tapped the side of her head. "I may be old, but I'm not foolish." Branson folded his hands. "You're absolutely within your rights, Margaret. But this kind of clarity, it cuts." She nodded slowly. "It's meant to." Later that afternoon, she returned home, her mind at ease. On her kitchen counter, she set up 3 envelopes. One marked David, one Linda, and one Tommy. Each letter was different, tailored, not cruel but honest. She poured her truth into them. The ways they made her feel invisible. The calls unanswered. The milestones missed. She told them she loved them, as she always had. But that love should not be confused with obligation. To David, she wrote about the times he missed her birthdays, too busy with clients and courtrooms, always running toward success but never back home. To Linda, she spoke of her search for peace, and how ironic it was that her mother became a casualty in that journey. To Tommy, her youngest, she was gentlest, but firm. "Dreams," she wrote, "are beautiful, but when they rely on someone else's savings, they become burdens." She ended each letter the same way. "I hope this isn't the only time you hear me." Then she sealed them and waited. She lived quietly after that, watched the seasons turn, fed the birds, talked to Harold, and when her time came, peacefully in her sleep, the envelopes were delivered, one by one. The sky outside Branson and Keller law offices was gray the morning of the reading. It matched the mood of the 3 siblings sitting in the reception room, each dressed in varying shades of black. The air felt thick, not just with grief, but with expectation, tension, and a lingering sense of guilt they couldn't quite place. David tapped his polished shoe nervously against the floor. He had flown in from New York, leaving an important deposition early. He glanced at his watch every few seconds, as if this were a business meeting. Linda scrolled her phone, posting a filtered black and white photo of her mother's framed portrait with a caption that read, "Rest in peace, goddess soul. You taught me grace." She added 2 dove emojis. Tommy chewed his nails, eyes darting around the room. He looked the most uncomfortable, perhaps because deep down, he knew he'd taken more from his mother than he had ever given back. Mr. Branson appeared at the doorway, clutching a thick folder. "If you'll come with me," he said, motioning them into the conference room. They sat around a long oak table, 3 glasses of water, 1 box of tissues. The will rested in front of Branson like a sealed fate. "Thank you all for coming," he began, removing his glasses and looking at each of them in turn. "Before I begin reading the will, I've been instructed to give each of you a letter from your mother." He passed the sealed envelopes one by one. David stared at his, unmoving. Linda opened hers immediately. Tommy hesitated, then tucked his into his jacket. Branson continued, "This will may come as a surprise." Margaret made her wishes very clear. He began to read. "To my children, I loved you the moment I knew you existed. I loved you when you cried, when you stumbled, when you succeeded, and even when you forgot me. But love is not a transaction. It is a legacy. And legacies are not given. They are earned." David blinked, stiffening in his chair. "I leave my home, all possessions therein, and the garden that your father and I built, to the Grand Rapids Women's Shelter, to be used as transitional housing for survivors of domestic abuse." Linda let out a short gasp. "To the local library, I leave $50,000 to establish the Harold and Margaret Lane Reading Nook for children. To the animal rescue that gave me Biscuit, I leave $25,000. Branson paused, then said calmly, "No assets, property, or money have been bequeathed to her immediate family." Tommy sat forward. "Wait, nothing. Not even the jewelry. Not even the savings." Branson nodded solemnly. "Nothing except the contents of your individual letters." David's voice trembled with a strange mixture of anger and confusion. "This isn't legal." She can't just erase us. She can, Branson replied. And she did. It's all been signed, notarized, and backed with documentation. Linda dropped her phone on the table, silent for once. Tommy finally opened his letter. His lips moved as he read, but no words came out. His eyes welled with tears. David looked at his letter, still unopened. Branson stood. I'll give you all a moment. When you're ready, Carmen, Margaret's caregiver, has requested to speak with you in the garden your mother loved so dearly. The door clicked shut behind him. And in the silence that followed, 3 grown children were forced to reckon with the legacy of a woman they had taken for granted. Not through screams or punishment, but through the power of remembrance. The lane garden was a tranquil masterpiece. Rose bushes in bloom, hummingbirds flitting through trumpet vines, and a weathered wooden bench nestled under a sprawling maple. The scent of lilac hung in the air, thick with memory. Carmen sat there waiting, her hands folded on her lap. When the Lane children stepped into the garden, their expressions were uneasy. None of them knew exactly why she had asked to speak to them. Tommy was the first to speak. Carmen, did you know about this? About the will? Carmen nodded slowly. Yes, I helped her prepare it. I witnessed her sign every page. David bristled. So you convinced her to cut us out? No, she said, her voice calm. She came to that decision on her own. I only helped her follow through. Linda folded her arms. And what was it? Some bitter guilt trip. Punishment from beyond the grave. Carmen looked at each of them. Your mother didn't want revenge. She wanted recognition. All she ever wanted was to be remembered. While she was still alive. They fell silent. Carmen continued. She spoke about each of you often. She kept your drawings, your school pictures, your old report cards. She was proud of you, even when you forgot her. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. We didn't mean to forget her. But you did, Carmen replied gently. She cooked dinner on holidays with an extra plate you never filled. She waited by the window every birthday, hoping for a visit. I saw her heart break a little more each year. David ran a hand over his face, exhaling deeply. She didn't want to hurt you, Carmen added. She just didn't want to be invisible anymore. The garden grew still. She asked me to give you something, Carmen said, pulling 3 small lockets from her purse. Each had a different flower etched on its front. 1 daisy, 1 rose, 1 tulip. She said they were her favorites when each of you were born. She handed them out. Inside each locket was a miniature photo. Margaret holding each child as a newborn. On the back of each photo was a single line, handwritten. Please remember me in spring. Tommy clutched his tightly, tears falling freely. Linda turned away, eyes red. David stared at his locket. His shoulders slumped. She loved you until her last breath, Carmen said. But she refused to be forgotten 1 minute longer. The siblings sat in the garden, surrounded by the blooms she had once planted for them. And for the first time in years they remembered. Not just the mother who had passed, but the woman who had lived. In the weeks that followed the reading of Margaret's will, something shifted. Not just in her children, but in the lives around them. David found himself reaching for his phone during quiet moments, half expecting a message from his mother. He reread her letter more times than he could count, each sentence landing heavier than the last. In court, where his words once flowed effortlessly, he found himself hesitating, distracted by memories he'd long buried. He started volunteering at the local library. It began as a guilt offering, but slowly turned into something more. He stood beneath the new wooden sign one day, the Harold and Margaret Lane reading nook, etched in soft gold. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful. He felt small, and strangely at peace. Linda returned to Sedona, but the spiritual retreats didn't feel the same. Her meditation felt hollow, her yoga performative. One afternoon, she sat with her journal and wrote, "Who was I trying to become while forgetting who made me?" She called her daughter, uncharacteristically emotional. "Do you remember Nana's house? The rose bushes." her daughter replied. Only from photos. That night, Linda booked a flight to Michigan. She wanted to walk the garden, alone, and apologize out loud. Tommy struggled the most. He had always leaned on Margaret for support. Financial, emotional, spiritual. Without her, he felt like a kite with no string. He wore the locket every day, clutching it during moments of panic. He tried to make amends in his own way. He got a part-time job at a community center. He repaired bicycles for neighborhood kids. When asked why, he said simply, "My mom taught me to build things. I forgot that for a while." The echo of Margaret's name wasn't loud, didn't scream. It lingered, in roses blooming on forgotten fences, in recipes rediscovered in old notebooks, in a locket pressed close to the heart, in a woman's name etched in gold beneath a children's reading nook. They had forgotten her in life. But in death, Margaret Lane refused to be forgotten. And slowly they began to remember. It was a bright spring morning when the Lane siblings reunited at their mother's old home, now the transitional shelter for women Margaret had so carefully chosen. The garden, still lovingly maintained by local volunteers, was in full bloom. David arrived first, holding a bouquet of tulips, Margaret's favorite. He hadn't brought flowers in years. Linda followed, dressed plainly, without the aura of mysticism she once wore like a shield. Tommy came last, his hands calloused from work, his eyes soft with regret. Carmen met them by the garden gate. "She would have liked this," she said simply. They walked the stone path in silence, past the hydrangeas, roses, and lilies. In the corner of the garden, a new plaque stood on a stone pedestal. It read, "In memory of Margaret Lane, a woman who chose to be remembered." There were no speeches, no ceremony, just presence. And presence was what Margaret had always wanted. David spoke first. "She taught me how to argue, but I never listened to her side." Linda added, "She was stronger than I ever gave her credit for." Tommy knelt and pulled a weed from beneath a rosebush. "I still dream of her hands. They were always moving, cooking, fixing, holding me up." They sat together on the bench beneath the maple tree, the same place Margaret once wrote her will in silence. They didn't talk about inheritance or what they lost. Instead, they spoke of Margaret's laugh, her peach cobbler, the stories she used to read. For the first time in decades, they saw her clearly, not just as mom, but as Margaret, a woman with her own hurts, her own joys, her own power. As the sun dipped behind the garden wall, David reached into his pocket and pulled out his locket. He opened it, reading the words on the back for what felt like the 1,000th time. "Please remember me in spring." "I do now," he whispered, and they all sat in silence together, remembering, full circle.